The Liberty Weekly podcast is brought to you by Tom Wood's Liberty Classroom. Sick of losing arguments with your statist friends? Fear no more. Now you can vanquish your intellectual foes with courses taught by top libertarian professors. Tool your intellectual arsenal and enroll today by navigating to www.libertyweekly.net/Liberty Classroom or by following the link in the show notes page.
Hello friends, Patrick McFarland here, as always, your host of the Liberty Weekly podcast. Welcome to episode 56 of the show, and this one is entitled Jury Nullification. And what I wanted this episode to be was the first episode in a series that I have planned dealing explicitly with trial by jury and the legal theory behind it. And what I'm going to be doing is using Lysander Spooner's work, Trial by Jury, as a framework for each episode. And this episode is based off of the first chapter. So you notice that I haven't done a solo episode in quite some time. I've mostly been doing interviews on YouTube, video podcasts, stuff like that. What I really wanted to do was rein the show in and bring it back and focus it to libertarian legal theory, which is a niche that has not been filled, what I've seen in the libertarian podcast market. So there's a lot of shows out there, not a lot of them dealing with what I wanted to deal with. And while I do enjoy having people on the show and doing interviews, that is not what the vision that I had. And so I think what I'm going to be doing is every week. I'm still shooting for 2 episodes. I want to do 1 interview per week and 1 solo episode dealing with some substantive legal thing. And I suppose whether the interview, there will be 1 episode that is based on libertarian legal theory per week. And that's what I'm aiming for going forwards. But this podcast is not available in a video version just because that takes so much longer to produce and edit. And I'm really under the gun right now in applying to the bar exam. I have a practicum class in my law school that's really eating up all my time. And so I don't have too much to devote towards the podcast right now. Just trying to streamline everything and, get that content out there and stay relevant. But I think this is a good step in the right direction. So before I get into that, though, I have one announcement, and that is this Saturday I will be speaking at the Agora Symposium at the Doubletree Hilton here in the Twin Cities. And it will be me, but also Trey Weaver from the Subversion webcast is giving a little talk too. Again, I'm not sure what time of day that we will be giving our talks, but we will be there, and at least I will be until 6 p.m. because I have a concert to go to that night. Killswitch Engage is playing in the cities, so I'm very excited for that. So if anyone is in the Twin Cities area and wants to meet up, hang out with a lot of awesome Liberty people, I would encourage you to check out that event at the Doubletree Hilton this Saturday, Agora Symposium. I will leave a link in the show notes page for that. So without further ado, I wanted to get into the Lysander Spooner's essay, Trial by Jury, Chapter 1. This episode is framed around that, but you can't see it, but I'm holding in my hands probably the most awesome library book that I've ever checked out. And this came from my law school library. It is a 1972 book entitled Let's Abolish Government. It's a brown book. That title is on the side, and on the cover it says The Right-Wing Individualist Tradition in America. And I'm the 3rd person ever to have checked out this book from my law school's library, and the last person before me to do so checked it out in 1980. So there's that adage that Tom Woods always jokes about, saying that if you are libertarian-minded in higher education, the good part is that all the good books are not checked out and available. They're definitely available for you to use. And furthermore, I've had this book since I was the first one to check it out in 27 years. I've had this book since September, since the beginning of this school year. And I've been just mulling my way through it and renewing it every time it comes up, trying to avoid fines. But the best part about it is that inside the front cover, it says advisory editors. And the first name on that list is Dr. Murray N. Rothbard of the Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn. So I was really thrilled to have this book and work my way through it, and subsequently I want to bring it to you. But essentially, it is just Lysander Spooner's works his original works. And the Constitution of No Authority is in here, an essay on the trial by jury, also a letter to Grover Cleveland on his false inaugural address, the usurpations and crimes of lawmakers and judges, and the consequent poverty, ignorance, and servitude of the people. So that's a really good one. But the first essay, Trial by Jury, was written in 1852 by Lysander Spooner. And to get into the substance of it, the first chapter deals with the right of juries, and this is very important, the right of juries to judge of the justice of laws and not merely the fact. So if in law school you realize the role that each party plays, you study that the jury's role is what is called a fact finder. What fact finders do is they determine what's true and like what actually happened in this case. And they don't determine the laws. They don't deal with the laws. And what Lysander Spooner is saying, that the jury is not only supposed to determine what happened in the real world, they should also view the law and judge the justice of the law too. I'll just start from the first paragraph here. Lysander Spooner says, for more than 600 years, that is, since Magna Carta in 1215, there has been no clearer principle of English or American constitutional law than that in criminal cases it is not only the right and duty of juries to judge what are the facts, what is the law, and what was the moral intent of the accused, but that it is also their right and their primary and paramount duty to judge of the justice of the law and to hold all laws invalid that are, in their opinion, unjust or oppressive, and all persons guiltless in violating or resisting the execution of such laws. And that's a huge thing that you don't learn, this hidden part of the etymology of a jury trial. And I think it's really important that Lysander Spooner kind of points this out, is that, and I'll get into this in the second episode too, because he talks about the origins of the Magna Carta and how everyone in the mainstream falsely interpreted what it said. And that's a very interesting part too. And actually, I'm pretty excited because what I wanted to do is take the mainstream modern orthodox opinion of what the Magna Carta is and was and compare it to Lysander Spooner's interpretation. And I think I'll do that in the next episode of this series. Why are jury trials important? Why is trial by jury important? Well, it is because you have the right to be judged by your peers. If you are going to be accused of something, you have the right to be brought in front of a tribunal, given due process, and your guilt, you have the option, the right to be judged by your peers. And why is this? Well, Lysander Spooner says it is because the trial by jury is a palladium of liberty. It is a barrier against the tyranny and oppression of the government. And essentially, Lysander Spooner's point is that either the jury can judge the justice of the laws and have a veto power against that explicitly, or this entire idea about the jury being the palladium of liberty is hogwash and completely moot, because without that power, they are mere putty in the hands, or in the best case scenario, they are mere putty in the hands of the government. In the worst case scenario, they become the actual executioners themselves. So in order to illustrate this point, Lysander Spooner goes back in time and traces the etymology of a jury trial and what originally it is. And he says that the trial by jury is originally supposed to be a trial by the country, or trial per país. I think that's Spanish or Latin or something like that. But it is essentially the people deciding what their liberties are against the government. And if the government decides what the people's liberty are, then that is the definition of despotism. And it is antithetical to the ideas of liberty. But furthermore, we can see the importance of what juries do just outright. Juries are supposed to be chosen at random. They are supposed to be the final barrier between the accused and the state. They're supposed to be of your peers, chosen at random. And the idea is that you cannot be sentenced or convicted of a crime without a unanimous verdict from the jury of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But there's a missing component there, because, and Lysander Spooner gets to talking about this on page 8. He says, so also, if the government may dictate to the jury what laws they are to enforce, it is no longer a trial by the country, but a trial by the government, because the jury then try the accused, not by any standard of their own, not by their own judgments of their rightful liberties, but by a standard dictated to them by the government. And the standard thus dictated by the government becomes the measure of the people's liberties. If the government dictate the standard of trial, it of course dictates the results of the trial, and such a trial is no trial by the country, but only a trial by the government. And in it, the government determines what are its own powers over the people, instead of the people's determining what are their own liberties against the government. In short, if the jury have no right to judge of the justice of a law of the government, they plainly can do nothing to protect the people against the oppressions of the government, for there are no oppressions which the government may not authorize by law. And if you think this is a farce or anything like that, the reality of the government dictating to the jury what they are to convict on is so apparent in any jury instruction. The jury receives their instructions that delineates to them, because juries are usually laymen. The jury instruction is chosen both by the court and petitioned by the litigants to instruct the jury in what the law is. And they say, if you find these elements to be met, you must convict. It is your duty. They phrase it this way: if the elements dictated to you in the jury instruction are met, it is your duty as a jury to convict. And that is false. And I can't say too much based on my own legal experience, because I haven't confronted this at all, and I'm taking the bar exam here this summer. So I'm hoping the podcast will be around in the next 2 years, is my hope. So I'm hoping to explain, or I suppose I could get a guest on to explain how this actually works in the real world, or what jury nullification is. But I think Tom Woods had an episode saying that he was on a jury duty, and he told the judge straight up, hey, I think the juries have the right to judge both the facts and the law, and he was dismissed. That's how it goes. But I wanted to explore more so this idea of the trial per país, or the trial by the country, as elaborated by Lysander Spooner, because he says, okay, they're chosen at random from your peers, and it's supposed to represent a good sample size of the country at large. And he says all classes of opinions present among the people. That means the opponents of the government and the friends of the government, and they're in order to secure conviction, you need a unanimous verdict. Well, the thing I found fascinating about reading this is that essentially Lysander Spooner is describing, I guess you could make a point that it's de facto anarchy, because from a de facto standpoint, if the government cannot convict anyone without the unanimous consent of their peers, then the government can't really do anything. They would need unanimous consent. If only we had a jury trial to enforce a new tax or something like that. While the government would still have a monopoly on the use of force, at least he's right, this would be a barrier against tyranny. I suppose it wouldn't be de facto anarchy, but in a certain sense, you could see it developing that way. If whatever the state wants to do, because since we know that the state dictates by violence, through the threat of violence, well, if they are emasculated through the proper through a properly functioning jury that judges the justice of the laws, the government would have no teeth, essentially. And, while I think Lysander Spooner obviously was an anarchist, this is a framework, I suppose, within the system that I could approve of, that if juries had this power, over the government. Hey everyone, before we get to the second half, just a quick word from our first sponsors here on the Liberty Weekly podcast, and that is Gotenna.com. And Gotenna is super, super exciting because they provide devices that allow you to mesh network with other cell phones that carry this device. And that allows you to send private encrypted chat messages and GPS location mapping. And this is very exciting. This is the first of its kind. This is the decentralized bottom-up revolution that we've been talking about. We've mentioned, mesh networking, Wi-Fi, and internet services. Well, this is for your cell phone. And aside from getting out from under the thumb of big cell phone corporations, this allows you to go abroad without a SIM card and to communicate communicate with people in your party. It also allows you to go out in the boonies where there's no cell phone service and send encrypted chat messages and GPS mapping if you're hunting out in the mountains somewhere. It's very interesting and very exciting for that. So head on over to gotenna.com, that is GOTENNA, and enter the promo code LIBERTY35, that's one word, and you'll get $35 off your first purchase. I also wanted to touch on this idea of evidence and the rules of evidence, because the one flaw that I see with this essay by Lysander Spooner is that he says, well, the jury should not be dictated to what the rules of evidence are. And I don't agree with that, because there's a reason why the rules of evidence exist, and the jury cannot be trusted to determine which facts they can see in the case. There's a reason why we don't just bring all the evidence available into the jury trial, because there are rules for, how reliable the evidence is or how prejudicial the evidence is. And I think that's the biggest issue. So if you have a jury of 12 people and they get to see all the facts in the case, well, okay, so let's say it's a murder case, and there is the accused, the defendant, is a man that has a stock of rifles. Let's say he's one of our types. Let's say he's one of our types and he has a bunker full of ammunition and rifles and stuff, and he's hauled in front of a tribunal or a court for first-degree murder, and the prosecution wants to enter in evidence of his stockpile of weapons. Well, certainly the fact it's a shooting death, and certainly the fact that the accused has a stockpile of weapons is probative. It makes it more or less likely that he committed the crime. There's some probative value there. It makes it more likely that a person with a stockpile of weapons would kill someone else. It's more likely, but but on the other hand, it's unduly prejudicial. The defense will argue, hey, we're in Massachusetts, right? And there's a bunch of lefty liberals on this jury, and they don't like guns. You can't enter this into evidence to prove that my client killed someone and premeditated it on this date. You can't enter evidence of his gun stockpile to say that was more or less likely. Surely it would make it more or less likely that he did it, but it's unduly prejudicial, because the moment the jury knows that he has a stockpile of weapons, they're going to hate him. They're going to hate him, and they're going to think that, oh, of course he did this. Of course he killed them. So there's a reason why we keep certain evidence from the jury, and I'm sure that Lysander Spooner knew that. So and he doesn't delineate this or detail it, but I would think that Lysander Spooner would propose an alternate means by which an alternate tribunal that would determine what evidence the jury sees or not. And that's just one thing, kind of taking this apart, but that is kind of a focal point of his argument, is saying that, well, if the state gets to determine what evidence the jury sees and hears, and if the state gets to determine what weight they give to that evidence, then the state is controlling the verdict, because they get to dictate to, the jury what the evidence is. And I think that this can be solved with free market anarchy and private alternative dispute resolution agencies, or DROs. I think that what I would like to see is a professional class of jurors, not to entrench the legal sphere any more than it already is, but I think that we should have and maybe we could just cut out the middleman and have, independent judges that can be hired. We already have this in the labor sphere, where a lot of times you'll get in alternative dispute resolution or in mediation, you'll get a free market of dispute resolution judges, basically, that will go on and hear cases. And although in mediation or arbitration, the judgment carries the coercive powers of the state and is enforceable by law, you could foresee a situation of arbiters that maybe don't have coercive powers, but people will come to voluntarily and agree to be bound by his decision. And I think, in a free market anarchist society, I think that this mechanism would exist still. This mechanism of, it would take care of the evidence problem, essentially, because you could have, an independent class of professional jurors that know how to deal with evidence and know what weight to give to the evidence, and the laws of supply and demand can essentially ensure that they will be unbiased, because if they are biased and they let in evidence that's controversial or should be barred, then no one is going to hire them to be a juror anymore. But that's an aside. I hope that was interesting. But to get back to the Lysander Spooner article specifically, he does address counter arguments, and I think I've detailed the crux of his argument here, that either juries, and he repeats this ad nauseum throughout the piece, but either juries can determine the justice of the laws, or the entire idea of what a jury trial is a whole sham illusion. And I think that that's true. But throughout it, in his argument, he addresses counter arguments, and the first one should be a very familiar counter argument. That is, quote, "The government is us." And Murray Rothbard takes care of this. He takes care of this in Anatomy of the State. The government obviously isn't us. It's not, the government has coercive powers. The government is imaginary. It's made up of people, just like you and I, except they have special legal rights to initiate violence. But the way that Lysander Spooner takes this argument is he kind of makes a Rothbardian argument, but he says that a Republican form of government requires many barriers to the execution of power. And we know this from, our high school civics class, indoctrination class. They say, well, in the federal government, we've dealt with the separation of powers. We have the judicial branch that has only certain powers and a certain job. We have the legislative branch that represents the people and creates the laws. And we have the executive branch that carries out the laws and has, their own power, and each branch will check each other. Okay. Well, Lysander Spooner adds two more branches to the government. He would say, there's the House, there's the Senate, there's the executive, there's the juries, and there's judges. And the most important branch of that is the jury, because the jury is the only microcosmic, if you'll excuse that term, the jury is the only microcosm that will protect the individual against the state in every single instance. In each instance that this comes up, the jury is there, and they are the final barrier between the actual carrying out of state power against an individual. And I think that's a fascinating argument, and it kind of goes towards what I was saying earlier, that the jury, if the jury had the ability to judge the justice of the law, it would be de facto anarchy, because if the state would have to convince a panel of 12 people, if the 12 people represent, they're an accurate sample size, maybe you would have one or two instances where the state would be approved. But I think it would be more often than not, unless there was an actual conviction to be made, an actual crime that took place. I think more often than not, the juries would strike down the government's law. And I think that would be great. I think that would be de facto anarchy. Except, in a sense of, I think people would do their jobs if it was clear cut that there was a crime. If someone was murdered or something, they would do justice because it's in their self-interest. So Lysander Spooner continues on saying that it doesn't matter how the government got its power. He's hinting at a government monopoly in this section. He doesn't explicitly come out and say that the government is a monopoly, but he's saying that if the people delegated the power to the government to dictate to them what the laws are, and if the people dictated that power and did not reserve the power of juries for themselves to judge the justice of the laws, then they've signed their own slave contracts, because he's saying, that the government will then dictate to the people what their liberties are. They have essentially born themselves into servitude in a certain sense. And obviously that's not binding, because, He also addresses and hints at the Constitution of No Authority, which I believe was written and published after this essay was, but saying that, well, constitutions don't work. They just don't work, because the government can't limit its own power. It will always find the power somewhere. And he also, and I think that's, patently true. I think the Supreme Court only struck down one or two federal laws in the entire 1900s. From 1900 to now, they've only struck down, a handful of laws. Another one is, he says, discussion or voting. And he says, well, to affect change in the government. And he says, discussion doesn't change anything. Discussion doesn't work unless it is followed by action, and clear action. Tyrants don't care about discussions that only end in discussion. I think that's a pretty good point he makes. And voting, he says, is only a periodic and unreliable majoritarian means by which to confront these problems. And I wouldn't think that Lysander Spooner would be any friend of democracy, but that's two wolves and one sheep deciding what is for dinner that night. And obviously he says power corrupts and attracts the corruptible. I think that's pretty clear. And he says judges only answer to the legislatures and not to the people. Judges in counties, judges are popularly elected, but when it matters, like in terms of the Supreme Court and the appellate courts, judges are appointed and they are not elected popularly. So the judges, there's collusion there. The judges only answer to the legislatures. And that being said, the judges are bound by the legislature because in the traditional theory, judges will say, well, I'm bound by the legislature. And they use that all the time. But the problem is that the legislature doesn't answer to the people. So he kind of concludes this section with a very powerful point that I'll read here. If the government is absolute for one day or is allowed to force obedience of its own powers for one day, then it secures its power for all time. And I think that's very powerful. He says famously, those capable of tyranny are capable of perjury to sustain it. So, and then after that, he reiterates that, the jury either has the power to judge the justice of the laws or it is, just a joke. It's a sham. He says, if trial by jury do not authorize individuals to nip tyranny in the bud, it does not authorize them to cut it down when its branches are filled with the ripe fruits of plunder and oppression. And that gives me goosebumps just reading it. But so essentially the trial by jury is the last and greatest legal defense against oppression. It is essentially, he says, the right to revolution never exists except for those stronger than the government. And this is the in-between. There's an in-between. So either you can revolt or you work within the legal process. Well, the common ground in the middle is the jury trial, the right of jury nullification, saying no, the legal right to do so. This is what prevents revolution. Is if we secure this power of the jury, it will prevent revolution. It is the legalization of disobedience and nullification on the microcosmic level. And this is an ancient established common law right. And I'll conclude here, but this will lead into the next episode 2, where I talk about the Magna Carta. But he establishes this as a common law right in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. He makes a constitutional argument too. However, just saying that in the Constitution, it says that the trial of all crimes shall take place in front of a jury, shall be by jury. And therefore, de facto, if they're referring to, the right of trial by jury that was established in the Magna Carta, Lysander Spooner argues that, well, of course, the jury then has the justice to judge the jury then has the ability to judge the justice of the law. And either that exists or the whole thing is a farce. And I hope anyone will tell me, how many times did you learn this in your civics class? I sure as hell didn't. And this is a hidden history. They want to convince you that this does not exist, is what I think. And you don't learn this in law school either, because of course in this modern day and age you will get the situation that I described earlier, where the jury instructions will be given to the jury and the government will say essentially, if it is your duty to convict if these elements are met, and you must convict, you must secure conviction. All right, everyone. So I'm going to wrap that up there. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this episode. It is a very important one, and I'm looking forward to returning to more of a legal format and solidify that niche that I've been talking about for episodes in the past doing. So hopefully be taking the initiative on that and executing it, actually. with that, I'm looking forward to the second episode in this installment, talking about the true nature of the Magna Carta and comparing that to a very big, very well-established and mainstream scholar by the name of Anne Lyon, or Lyon, who wrote the definitive, I guess, modern accepted work on the history of the English Constitution. So we're going to be reconciling her views with that of Lysander Spooner, and I think it'll be really interesting. So that should be out next week sometime, barring any catastrophic busyness that I find myself into. But until then, I'm Patrick McFarland. Once again, the show notes are at libertyweekly.net/56. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
In the early days of the internet, radical libertarians were scattered, lonely, and faceless. Without direction, they resigned to scour the web, sifting through content providers in a wasteland plagued by YouTube demonetization, Facebook jail, and covert internet censorship. But then, in 2017, the Libertarian Union was formed. Finally, the average Joe libertarian could find a thriving community of independent podcasters and content providers, all in one convenient location. At Libertarian Union, we'll always have the latest news, interviews, discussions, and even movie reviews. With hundreds of episodes and more added all the time, you'll always find something fresh at libertarianunion.com.